This documentary is not about whitewashing the sins of the South, and it is not about whitewashing the sins of the North. They need to be acknowledged and repented of. But let the record be truthful. Most Americans today believe that Southerners fought to preserve slavery. They have been led to believe that hundreds of thousands of young Southern boys who were not slave owners and had no interest in slavery went to war against a numerically superior foe and endured 4 long years of hardships, all in order to allow a few rich men to keep their slaves. Historically speaking, slavery has been colorblind. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the word slave to Slavs, or white people of Eastern Europe. The Romans enslaved thousands of early white inhabitants of Great Britain, who were known as Angles, from which we derive the term Anglo-Saxon. Among the ancient Greeks, the enslavement of whites and even fellow Greeks was the order of the day. From the 8th to the 11th century, France was a major transfer point for Irish and Flemish white slaves to the Muslim world. In the 11th century, the Vikings took slaves from Ireland to be sold in Muslim Spain, Scandinavia, and Russia. The word kidnapper comes from the word kidnapper. It was first coined in Britain after Parliament passed legislation in 1664, which allowed for the capture of white children off the streets of Great Britain. They were then shipped out in chains and sold into slavery. An average cargo ship had capacity for 300 slaves, and the mortality rate was often over 50%. Young children seldom survived the horrors of a voyage of 7 to 12 weeks. In 1638, one ship was bound for the colonies with 350 white slaves, but only 80 arrived alive. How many tourists today who take vacations to Caribbean islands such as Jamaica and Barbados know that they are visiting the site of a gruesome Holocaust against white slaves who died by the thousands? According to the 1830 census record, more than 10,000 black slaves in the United States were owned by other blacks. In 1860 in Sumter, South Carolina, William Ellison, a free man of color, had 70 slaves working his plantation. In Louisiana, in St. Landry Parish, a free man of color, Auguste Donato, held 70 slaves to work his 500-acre plantation. In New York City in 1830, 8 free men of color owned 17 slaves. Some of the most prominent families in the North were slaveholders, such as the DeWolf family of Rhode Island. In 1637, in the northern colony of Massachusetts, the Desire was the first slave ship to be built in America. It would be the first of many Yankee ships that would bring slaves back from Africa. The Confederate flag never once flew over a slave ship, but the United States flag flew over many. The Constitution of the Confederate States of America was opposed to the importation of African slaves. Article 1, Section 9 states, quote, "The importation of Negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America is hereby forbidden, and Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectually prevent the same." End of quote. Slavery in southern states was not widespread. The tenant farmer made up most of the South, and most did not own slaves. If he did, that slave may have been like a member of the family. The large slave-owning population of the South was only 2 or 3% of the population. Racial prejudice knew no boundaries, and in fact had a strong foothold in the northern states. Alexis de Tocqueville was an aristocratic Frenchman who traveled to America and wrote of his experiences in a 2-volume study titled Democracy in America. Unlike most abolitionists, he traveled extensively in both the North and the South to study the realities of American culture. He wrote, quote, "The prejudice of the race appears to be stronger in the states that have abolished slaves than in the states where slavery still exists. White workers will not work side by side with the blacks in the North, but do in almost every southern state, end of quote. Connecticut passed a law declaring that non-resident blacks could not attend public schools because, quote, it would greatly increase the number of colored people in the state, end of quote. New Jersey passed one of the first laws that prohibited free blacks from settling there. In 1853, Indiana's constitution stated that, quote, no Negro shall come into or settle in the state, end of quote. In 1853, Abraham Lincoln's home state of Illinois passed a law to prevent Negroes from, quote, coming into this state and remaining 10 days with the evident intention of residing in the same, end of quote. In 1862, while the men in blue from Illinois were pillaging the South, the Illinois state constitution was amended, declaring that, quote, no Negro shall immigrate or settle in this state, end of quote. In July 1863, just 10 days after Gettysburg, hundreds or perhaps thousands died in street riots in New York City. The disturbances began as a protest against the draft, but quickly turned into an ugly race riot in which at least a dozen blacks were lynched by the mob. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave, nor was it intended to free a single slave. Its sole purpose was propaganda. It did not apply to slaves in the North, as it states, quote, within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be in rebellion against the United States, end of quote. Nor did it apply to southern states that were occupied by Northern troops, such as parts of Louisiana and West Virginia. The proclamation states that these accepted areas were, quote, left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued, end of quote. During an 1858 debate, Lincoln stated, quote, I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race, end of quote. Lincoln also stated that he was in favor of returning Negroes to Africa. At the beginning of the war, Ulysses S. Grant's wife held personal slaves. They were eventually freed, not by Lincoln's proclamation, but by the 13th Amendment, passed after the end of the war. One of the most obscure documents in the Library of Congress is called the Slave Narratives. The narratives are testimonies of over 2,300 former slaves who gave first-hand accounts about their treatment on Southern plantations. Affection for former masters and mistresses is expressed in terms of unmistaken devotion. Testimony to the good treatment and kindness and gentleness of the so-called heartless slave owners. There was mistreatment and wickedness on the part of some, but as the narratives make clear, these were a distinct small minority. And of this minority, many of the men were brought to trial and convicted for what they did to their slaves.